Listen, have you ever asked, how many people does it take to give me the number of average handle time? Like, what is our average handle time? And you keep getting a different answer no matter who you ask. You have yet to get the same answer. Well, this episode is for you. This episode on Tipsy Thursdays, we are talking about aligning to the points of truth, understanding what those points of truth are in your organization, and how points of truth can drastically change the results, drastically impact your customer experience, drastically impact your employee experience, and how workforce management plays a critical role in helping you to align those points of truth. And so this episode, I'm super excited to welcome the VP of Customer Service over at QuickMD, Colin Crowley himself. Colin, thank you so much for being our guest on this week's episode. I am over the moon excited. You were our guest, one of our guests last year in our episodes, and we absolutely love you. And so we've been talking about data. Right, this is what we're talking about this month. We're using WFM Go Beyond all year. So if you haven't grabbed your copy of WFM Go Beyond, make sure that you grab your copy at wfmgobeyond.com. But we're using WFM Go Beyond this year to guide all of our conversations in workforce management so that we can go beyond just the tactics of doing forecasting, scheduling, and intraday. While they are extremely important to making sure you have a strong foundation in that, we have to go beyond that if we want to be transformative leaders. And so I wanted to bring in you as a transformative leader and talk about points of truth and why that's so important. But before we do, for those that don't know you, Colin, tell us a little bit more about you. Tell us about your role over at QuickMD and give us a fun fact.
Sure. Thanks, Juanita. It's great to be here again. I am the VP of Customer Service at QuickMD. So we are a telehealth provider in the U.S., especially focused on opioid use addiction treatment and weight loss, but also primary and urgent care. So you can get a bunch of different services through us. So definitely check us out. And I've also been in the healthcare space before at some other companies as well. So I've meandered in healthcare. But then I've also navigated between a bunch of different verticals. So I've been in e-commerce a whole bunch, and I've been in financial services, and I've been in SaaS as well. So I kind of peeked under the hood at one point to see how things run in a software perspective, which was a lot of fun. But yeah, over the past 15 years or so, I've led different customer experience organizations. I guess fun fact about me is I balance out my work life with a separate life as a playwright and a theater person, which I tap into a lot in the customer service world in interesting ways.
That's so cool. That's so cool. I didn't know that you dabbled in, you said playwright?
That's right. I have like a parallel career as a playwright in theater. And at one point was sufficiently adventurous enough as to found a small theater company. And then this is like 10 years ago. So I would kind of put on the producer's hat as well. But most of the time has been spent actually writing and seeing my plays produced.
So, I got to harass you offline after Tipsy Thursdays about this production and all the different things. So stay tuned for that, Colin. But so we stay on track, okay? Because the creative in me wants to go down that lane so bad, so badly, but I'm going to stay focused. So I want to hop right in. My first question that I have for you is, can you share an experience where maybe you had multiple data sources that cause issues and how was that resolved? How did you find it and who found it and how did that impact your day-to-day of what you were doing?
Yeah, I mean, one example I can provide is actually at a prior healthcare company experience. We had dislocated data for two reasons. One is that we were using disparate systems to engage with our patients and providers. So we had one system we were using for ticketing and phones, and another system that we were using separately for actually texting. So one challenge was the fact that we were unnecessarily using different systems where we could have used one to begin with. And I think that's the challenge a lot of companies have, is that for some reason you end up with a kind of Frankenstein tech stack for reasons which it made sense at the time, but don't make sense for medium or longer term planning purposes. And then you reach a point where you say, why are we using these different systems? And the second thing is just the complexity. And actually healthcare is a good example of this. is where you're triaging between different types of customers, if you would. So you may have patients on the one hand receiving care, but then you may have to triage between doctors and clinics as well, who are directly providing care to patients who are accessing that service through you. So that creates its own level of complexity, because you not only have a tech stack that's disparate, but you also have to track workforce management across different types of customers who are all intimately tied together, because your ability to be there to service the doctors when the doctors are available to get updates for patients is just as critical as being able to service the actual patients themselves. So you're balancing out multiple different realities, and you may be contacting clinics and doctors in a very different way from how you're contacting patients, because clinics still very much live in a world of phone calls and fax messages, and doctors similarly, you need kind of a quick way to be able to engage with them. So maybe using some sort of in-app chat system, versus how you're contacting patients. So it just adds to a lot of complexity in your data model. And we're really able to address that first by getting a more unified tech stack. So removing excess softwares that we didn't need. So we at least were looking at a single source of truth. And secondly, respecializing different areas of the organization to concentrate on those different types of customers, rather than have all those different customer contacts coming in to one general blob in the organization, which made it harder to structure different standards around how do we engage with patients versus doctors versus clinics. So specializing that organizationally allowed us to create different models around each one of those experiences that we could apply to agents and hold them accountable. So that's kind of one example about how the actual tech stack and also the disparate nature of different customers that you may have that you have to service can really create challenges in having a clear workforce management model.
I love that. Something that you just said was I don't even know if the audience caught this or not, but it was so profound to me, is these multiple, you didn't say this word, but this is what I interpreted it as, these multiple universes that you are having to manage simultaneously, right? So you have this member experience, you have the doctors, you have the facilities, you have patients, you have all these different universes, parallel universes that are running simultaneously. And depending on how you communicate, depending on how that universe communicates, right? So if in the doctor universe, they communicate in in-app chat and the different things. So you have this one point of truth or source of truth there. But then you have maybe patients that are communicating via phone and they're calling in and they're, doing certain things. And then you have the clinics that are using fax, and they're in insurance companies. Like, you have all these different personas and all these different universes that you are having to, as the VP of customer experience or customer service rather, saying, okay, how do I communicate effectively with all of these different personas in a way that they are most comfortable with, right? But also still maintain data integrity. How do I do that? So that's super cool. Hey, transformative leader, listen, have you grabbed your copy of WFM Go Beyond? Go and grab your copy at WFMGoBeyond.com. WFM Go Beyond is sectioned into two sections. Section 1 is the foundation and the fundamentals of workforce management. The core 4, you've heard me talk about this: data gathering, forecasting, scheduling, intraday. But section 2 is the part that I get super excited about, especially for 2025, because we are pushing and encouraging and challenging leaders to go beyond and push into transformative impact. And section 2 is going to do that to help you understand how you tie your WFM strategy into your CX initiatives, your EX initiatives, and business profitability goals. So if you're an operational leader, executive, a WFM leader that has a operations efficiency goal, hey, you want to drive transformative impact, WFM Go Beyond is your resource. So go to WFMGoBeyond.com and grab your copy today. Bye. Colin, can you tell me, how do you go about doing that, right? What's your first step? If you had to give someone like, hey, this is, as VP of customer service, and I'm coming into this organization, you're mentoring a new VP of customer service or maybe a director of customer service, and you're mentoring them and they're saying, Colin, like, my data got data, my sources got sources. How do I unify this? Because we just got too much stuff going on and I can't really get to what the source of truth is, what's a piece of advice that you would give them? What's one of the first steps that you would take?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I honestly just think that the first step does come down to technology because everything's dependent on the technology you're using, even to be able to drill down into the data you have, because some systems are much more data rich and also allow you to do a lot more with customizing data. So even across different data points you have, you can build different types of metrics out of that data. And I actually remember that was one of the things I think we chatted about last time about how you can kind of customize data to suit what most interests you in terms of what you want to track. But I think it really comes down to that because a lot of companies, in my experience, foundationally, they're either using a software that does not give them very full-fledged ability to track data and track all those data points that they need to track. And so when they try to create a single source of truth, it's hard to do that because they're doing that with very, very limited information. And again, that could be because of limitations in the tool they're using, or it could be because of the fact that they're using too many disparate tools, or even if they're using disparate tools, they're not united together in a single source of truth like a Power BI or something. So I think it really does start with the technology component in making sure that you're at least unifying data through a single software solution or a single third-party solution that's pulling data from all these different places. And then once you have that data, then that's when you can at least go through the process of starting to dig into it and understand what it means. But a lot of companies are dealing with a limited data set, and that's where their foundational problems start.
In your experience, can you tell me what role WFM plays in data alignment?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different things. I mean, the first thing is that WFM forces you to think about data that you otherwise wouldn't have to think about, which I think helps you to be much more rigorous in your understanding of the data points that you do have. So like one example, for instance, is when you start to think a workforce planning model, you start to think of more intricacies in your customer contacts, whatever those may be. So you start to think more about things like, well, not all contacts are created equal, even though you just may be counting numbers in a system. But you look at, there's a difference between high priority and a lower priority. And there's difference in that in terms of sensitivity, time sensitivity, and getting back to customers and the amount of effort it takes to resolve certain contacts. So it makes you think about things like that not all contacts are created equal. And how can you create allowances around that in the system? Because in a workforce management system, you don't want to create perverse incentives for agents to rush people off the phone. So you have to build into it some understanding of, well, you need to spend more time on certain types of customers. And so it forces you to think, well, what are those customers and what are the circumstances where you have to spend that extra time? And you may have thought of that anecdotally as a leader in the past, but you may not have put structure behind it where you actually define what are different types of contacts and what are different allowances for the work that goes into those contacts. Do you actually have to put the numbers on paper and you start holding people accountable for it? So I think that's one thing, is that WFM forces you to think about data in more intricate ways than you otherwise would have to think about data. I also think very closely related to that, WFM forces you to put more definitions around what your data points are. So a perfect example, if you're involved in like the messaging space and maybe you're engaging with your customers over SMS or some sort of a synchronous type of a system like that, is you have to define what a conversation is. Because in an asynchronous system, like again, SMS or WhatsApp is another example, you have an endless back and forth essentially with a customer. But for workforce management purposes, you need to define what actually is a singular conversation, even though you may have a free flowing text back and forth. Where customers are coming into and out of that experience at different points, having different questions or different concerns and maybe bucketed under different issues. But it's not like a live chat system where you naturally have a session-based system where you can segregate, well, this is one issue, this is another issue, this is another issue, because it's that endless stream of contact consciousness, so to speak. And that creates challenges because you have to define the differences between different situations that your customers have. So that forces you to dig into that data and actually define what is a conversation and when do we determine that a conversation has ended. So let's say after you don't hear from a customer after 2 days, then you say, well, whatever issue they had, we consider that resolved. And if they contact us again, that's a new issue. Or do you use AI to try to understand what different issues there may be? But that's a great example of how you even have to define what something is. And a workforce management system forces you to do that in order to plan your way around different types of issues. I say another thing is workforce management systems force you to define expectations around workflow in a more holistic way. So it forces you to think not only about the volume of contacts coming in and some of those more basic things that any customer support system can track, such as, number of calls per hour, emails per hour, and average handle time. But it also forces you to think, what is the quality you want to go into those conversations? And where's that tipping point where if you're pushing people too fast, quality goes downhill? So workforce management really requires you thinking about that qualitative component and having a way to track that. And that's a whole other question with data, where sometimes you have to go out of your way, find how you track quality through surveys or through a quality assurance program. Or now, of course, there's so many different solutions with AI that help to make that much more manageable. You need some sort of way of defining quality and including that in your model. Otherwise, you're constantly pushing people to get the customer off the phone and solve the email and so on and so forth, and you're not necessarily taking into consideration quality. So workforce management forces you to put data behind quality and define quality in a more metric-centered way.
Colin, we need to pass the offering plate, because the way you just came in here and preached about this, it don't make no sense, okay? Amazing. Like, okay, I did not prep Colin. The audience think I be prepping y'all on these answers, right? And I did not, okay? That was so amazing, because what you said was so true. I was over here taking notes like, okay, yes, I need to write an article on that, because it's so true, right? Workforce management does require you and force you. I love that you chose the word force, because I was talking to you about, like, so I go into these organizations that they either are doing one or two things, right? They're either standing up a WFM tool, and so we're doing the professional services for them to stand up the workforce management solution. However, the more evolved organizations will say, hey, we don't want to just stand up a workforce management solution. We need to stand up and sometimes reevaluate our WFM processes. So those are two different things that I'm usually trying to get organizations to understand. It's one thing to stand up a WFM solution. It's another to stand up or reevaluate your WFM processes, right? And so one of the things that when organizations do take the challenge to say, okay, let's really peer into underneath the surface. Let's really peer underneath the surface and say, what are our WFM processes and how are we doing workforce management? It forces them to do exactly what you just said. It forces them to look into their data, right? Because we're just not pressing buttons in the tool, right? We're not just saying, oh, spit out this forecast, right? Or spit out these schedules. We're saying, okay, first of all, is there data alignment between your WFM tool and your telephony system or your chat system or your CRM tool? Where are your points of truth? Right. So it forces them to look at their data and ensure that their data is actually correct and adequate and accurate. So it forces them to do that, which is why it's the first chapter in WFM Go Beyond. Data, the reason that's the first chapter is not because I didn't have anything else to do and I was just guessing. The reason it's the first chapter, well, technically it's the second after the intro, but it's the first chapter in the practice is because it's the most common. If I go to 100 organizations, 90 of them are going to have a challenge with data. It's either inaccurate, it's incomplete, or it is very disparate, right? Like you don't understand it, right? So you're making decisions off of data that you don't truly understand. Case in point, I was talking to an organization about their average handle time. And so we were looking at their report and the talk time was higher on the report than the AHT. And so as a trained eye looking at this, I'm like, that's no way possible that could be the case. Average handle time cannot be higher than average talk time. Why, Juanita? Why can that not be the case? Because a lot of times organizations are looking at talk time. Average handle time is a part, right? Talk time is a part of average handle time. So you have talk time and ACW that comes up with your average handle time. If I'm looking at a report that says talk time is higher than average handle time, I already know something is wrong. At the very minimum, if you do not include ACW inside of your formula of average handle time, at the very minimum, average handle time should be the same as talk time, right? Because sometimes organizations will say, hey, we don't allow our agents to go into ACW, and so all we're counting is average talk time. And so their talk time is generally the same as their average handle time. But there's no way the average handle time should be lower than your talk time. And so that told me by just looking at their report, hey, something's wrong with your data. But this is a report they have been producing for ages, as well as providing to customers that, hey, this is our talk time, this is our average handle time. And just from looking at it, I'm like, something's wrong with this. This can't be correct. And so as we dug into it, right, back to your point about how WFM forces you to dig into your data, it's not good enough to just have data. And this is what we're talking about going beyond. Organizations think that just because they have the data that they get a pat on the back. No, just having the data is not good enough. You have to be able to understand the data. Is it accurate? Is it complete? And does it actually make sense for that data point? And so for that data point, it didn't make sense. Either way you sliced it, right? Whether you're an organization that says, hey, we don't allow people to go into ACW, so our average handle time is only our talk time or talk time and hold time. Or, hey, we do allow agents to go into ACW, and so our average handle time is our talk time and ACW. Either way, the data point for what it was producing didn't make sense for the organization. So I love that you said your very first point, right, is that WFM it forces you to dig into your data. Hey, are you ready to identify how well your workforce management strategies align to your CX, customer experience, EX, employee experience, or your business profitability goals? Well, take our free 5-minute assessment at WFMGoBeyondScore.com and get your personalized results and recommendations delivered directly to your inbox. WFMGoBeyondScore.com. See you there. And then the second thing that I absolutely love that you said, Colin, was that it forces you to define the data, because that's exactly what happened in this scenario. They had to then go and define, okay, what is AHT for our organization? Is average handle time, talk time, and ACW? Or because we don't allow agents to go into ACW, it just automatically goes into the next call. Is it just talk time? WFM forces you to define what AHT is, which is why I hate is a strong word. It makes me twitch a little bit, right? When organizations say, well, industry standard is, well, we're not talking about industry standard. We're talking about your organization. What is the culture and the environment in your organization? If you don't allow agents to go into ACW, then it doesn't make sense that your average handle time would be talk time plus ACW. Right? Because you don't allow them to go into ACW. So it would make sense that your average handle time is just talk time and hold time, whatever the time is that they put the caller on hold. So that would make sense in your scenario. But if you are an environment that allow agents to go into ACW because they have a lot of casework that they have to follow up on, or whatever the case may be, it makes sense that you would include ACW and AHT as your formula. And so really understanding and defining what that data point is and how you get to that data point, and is that data point then now making it into your other systems that are your point of reference for how you make decisions, right, around maybe scheduling or how you forecast or how the next person is going to be available, is so, so important. And then the last point you made, right? I mean, you made so many good points, right? I was like, this is good. The last point that you made was around, it requires you to define then the workflow. Because it does. So many times as leaders, we have this idea and this concept of what's happening at the ground level or with our agents about like, oh, a caller calls and then they answer the call and then they do X, Y, and Z and then they do ... And this is what happens with the interaction. But it's not until you start to dig into that data that you realize, well, wait, they are going into ACW and they spend 4 minutes in ACW. Why? Because they have to do this and this and this. And so you begin to have to then really look at what the workflow is to say, oh, we need to probably build this into our model. This is why we're so extremely understaffed, because I was thinking that I was going to have this person back on the phone by now, but because of the type of interaction that they're dealing with, they have X, Y, and Z. And so it really requires you then, it forces you to really dig into that data to understand, okay, what is the workflow that I'm missing? And and do I need to account for this in this interaction? You said so many great things, Colin. I think we're gonna have to do a part 2 to this. We're gonna have to do a part 2 to this because it was so good and so rich. I'm gonna ask you one last question. I'm gonna let you go because I want to be respectful of your time and our listeners' time. What is a myth? You can choose. I'm gonna let you choose. All right. I'm gonna let you choose, and then the audience will come back and tell us if you chose right. What is a common myth when dealing with points of truth or data that you've discovered, or if you had to give a piece of advice around dealing with data better, single points of truth, would you give, right? So a common challenge that you're like, if you could dispel that that myth right now and help somebody, what would that myth be? Or if a piece of advice that you would give to someone that's dealing with a lot of data that they're maybe overwhelmed and like, okay, what's my next step?
Probably under both categories would be the tendency of thinking that the workforce management system that you're creating is ultimately for your own team primarily and its operational effectiveness. So I think it's very easy to get very siloed. And sometimes this is actually made worse by the fact that you're digging into data, because it can make you almost like, you can't see the forest for the trees type of thing. So it's good that you're kind of deep into the data, but you also want to make sure you don't reach a point where you're just engaging with the data for data's sake, and you think that, I'm primarily doing this because I want to, improve certain metrics that I track within my organization, without stepping back and saying, how do those metrics in turn relate to how the company is doing? So it's great if you want to track response times for email and chats, and you want to track call times and all sorts of things. But how is the effectiveness and the efficiency that you're aiming to create by having a tighter workforce management model, how is that represented not only just in cost savings, but how is that ultimately represented in cost generating ways or revenue generating ways for the company? So just being mindful of siloing your focus into what's most immediately relevant in your customer support organization, and making sure that you can tie what you're tracking back to something that's revenue generating on a corporate level. And that can take some extra work, and that can be extra complex at times, but I think that's often missed in the minutiae of building workforce management models.
That is so good. So I have a saying that you can't manage what you don't measure, but you shouldn't always manage what you measure. And so that is case in point. I remember being at this large global healthcare organization, and for workforce management, of course, we need to understand what average handle time is, AHT, because that's part of our formula for how we forecast. But it's not necessarily, and it was something that we would track. We used to track on the agent's dashboard, and they used to see it and all the different things. We took it away, and that actually improved their average handle time. But that doesn't mean that we didn't continue to measure it as workforce management, because it was a part of our formula. So many times we dive into data and we get paralysis by analysis, right? We're diving in, especially I'm guilty, right? I'll dive into this data and I'll get stuck there, and it's like, okay, what is the point? So you shouldn't, I always say you can't manage what you don't measure, but you shouldn't necessarily always manage everything you're measuring. And so that is super important to understanding the so what. Why am I measuring this? Is this because I'm trying to drive a behavior, or it ties to a strategic goal inside of the organization? Or is this because, I need it as a part of my internal input to produce a forecast or produce a schedule or whatever the case may be? And so it's very important that you understand why you're using that data and what's the intended outcome, and that you don't get the paralysis by analysis. And so that was super amazing. Thank you so much, Colin, for being our guest on this week's Tipsy Thursday.
Thanks so much, Juanita.
Guys, how epic was that? We definitely got to have Colin back this year on this episode, on this season, because I know you guys are going to have tons of questions about data. We're going to we're using WFM Go Beyond all year to guide our conversations on not only the tactical parts of workforce management, but how do we go beyond that? And some of the things that Colin said, I know is going to be questions that I get feedback on and we want to dive deeper into. So you all already know what to do. If you have yet to grab your copy, right, because we're using this as a guide to guide all of our conversations this year, go to WFMGoBeyond.com. Also, if you want to know what your Go Beyond score is, make sure you go to WFMGoBeyondScore.com to get your organization's WFM maturity score so that you can understand kind of where you're tracking and where you have opportunities to improve. Until next time, guys, you already know what to do. Go be great and let's make impact. See you guys soon. Bye.